how much tyranny you have to impose in order to produce something like equality of outcome. And Thomas Sowell's talked about this a little bit too. He said, what the people who are agitating for equality of outcome don't understand is that you have to cede so much power to the authorities, to the government, in order to ensure equality of outcome that a tyranny is inevitable.
What if the single most seductive idea in human history, the vision of a perfectly equal world, is also the most dangerous? What if the promise of a world without oppression, where every single person is valued and no one gets left behind, isn't a map to utopia, but to a hell of our own making? They promised justice, they promised fairness, they promised an end to suffering. What they delivered, time and again, was surveillance, famine, and death on a scale that is just beggars belief. This is the story of how noble ideals, when held by people absolutely certain they are right, were twisted into tools of absolute power. This is the story of when equality became tyranny. In the 20th century, governments killed more than 200 million of their own people, and that number doesn't even include deaths from war. The vast majority of these weren't random acts of madness, but the work of organised, systematic regimes. And the most murderous of them all, responsible for well over half of those deaths, all marched under the same banner, creating a new, more equal world. They were the communist states, the Soviet Union, China, and their ideological cousins. They all started with a promise that spoke to the deepest hopes of the poor and oppressed. But that promise hid a playbook, a sequence of events so consistent it was like it was rehearsed. It's a playbook that turns hope into horror, and its last chapter is always written in blood. To get why this tragedy happened, you first have to understand the dream. The promise of equality isn't evil. It's born from real suffering and righteous anger. For thousands of years, most of humanity lived under the thumb of aristocrats, kings, and emperors. Your birth decided your destiny. You were born a peasant, you died a peasant, and everything you worked for was taken to make some distant lord richer, a lord who saw you as property, not a person. Then came the Industrial Revolution, which just swapped one kind of misery for another. The factory owner replaced the feudal lord. Men, women, and even children worked brutal hours in dangerous conditions for next to nothing, their lives run by the constant churning of machines. The cities swelled with a new class of people, the proletariat, who owned nothing but their own labour. It was in this world of stark, brutal inequality that a new idea took root, an idea so powerful it would change the world. Karl Marx gave it its most powerful voice. He saw history not as a bunch of random events, but as a story of class struggle. The oppressors versus the oppressed. The bourgeoisie who owned the factories, the land, the money, against the proletariat who had nothing. Marx argued this system wasn't just unfair, it couldn't last. He predicted that the world's workers, pushed to their absolute limits, would eventually rise up in a violent revolution. They'd seize the means of production, get rid of private property, and tear down the state that only served the rich. And what would come next? A temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, a workers' state that would wipe out the last traces of the old world. And after that, utopia. A society without classes or a state. A world where the rule would be from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. No more exploitation, no more poverty, no more war. A world of perfect equality, plenty, and peace. This was the promise, and it was intoxicating. For the farmer breaking his back in a field he'd never owned, for the factory worker coughing his lungs out in a mill, for the intellectual ashamed of a world built on so much injustice. This wasn't just some political theory, it was salvation. It was a paradise on earth. And then leaders appeared, claiming they had the key to this paradise. Men like Vladimir Lenin in Russia, promising the starving, war-torn masses bread, peace, and land. Men like Mao Zedong in China, vowing to lift his nation out of centuries of feudalism and foreign humiliation. Men like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who spoke of a socialist revolution to empower the poor by redistributing the country's huge oil wealth. They all followed a similar script, what you could call the communist playbook. First, you find a grievance and promise equality. You get the masses on your side with powerful talk of the people versus the elites. You frame the fight not as a political disagreement, but as a moral crusade. Once you're close to power, you grab it. And then you start the most important step. You centralize that power. This is always sold as a temporary, necessary evil, a way to protect the revolution from its enemies at home and abroad. But this is the point of no return. Because a perfectly equal society requires a perfect society. And a perfect society has no room for imperfection. It has no room for dissent. It has no room for individuality. To get to utopia, society has to be re-engineered, and the people in it have to be remade. Anyone who resists, anyone who holds onto old ways of thinking, old loyalties like family or religion, isn't just an opponent. They are an obstacle, a class enemy, a counter-revolutionary, and obstacles have to be removed. This is the moment the promise starts to sour. This is when the dream of equality begins its slide into the nightmare of tyranny. The first big test of this utopian promise came in Russia, 1917. The Bolshevik Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, was a power grab born from the chaos of World War I and the collapse of the Tsar's regime. The slogan, bread, peace, and land, was pure political genius, speaking directly to what the Russian people desperately wanted. But the reality that came after the promise was all about terror and control. Lenin and his party believed that to build a communist paradise, the old world had to be completely obliterated. Disagreeing wasn't tolerated. It was treated like a disease that threatened the whole revolution. The Cheka, the first in a long line of Soviet secret police, was created to find and eliminate counter-revolutionaries. This kicked off the Red Terror, a campaign of mass arrests and executions that set the stage for everything to come. But it was under Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, that the logic of revolutionary equality led to its most monstrous end. Stalin saw society as something you could engineer, like a machine. And the fuel for his machine, the forced, lightning-fast industrialization of the Soviet Union, was going to be squeezed out of the countryside. In 1929, he launched a policy of forced collectivization. The state basically declared war on its own peasants. The independent farmers, the backbone of Russia for centuries, were forced to give up their land, their animals, their homes, and join massive state-run collective farms. Anyone who resisted, or was just doing a little better than their neighbors, was labeled a kulak, a rich peasant, a class enemy. They were declared enemies of the state, an entire group of people to be wiped out. Hundreds of thousands were arrested, shipped off to the frozen wastelands of Siberia, or just shot. The goal was to break the will of the peasants and get total control over the nation's food. The result wasn't abundance, but a catastrophe of biblical proportions. With their land and any reason to work gone, farm production collapsed. But the state's demands didn't stop. They got bigger. Stalin's regime set insane grain quotas for places like Ukraine, a nation with a strong identity that the Soviets wanted to crush. In 1932, when the quotas weren't met, party activists and secret police were sent into the villages. They went from house to house, using iron rods to search for hidden grain, an often reported tactic to uncover food concealed by starving families. They took everything edible, seed for the next harvest, potatoes, livestock, even the family pets. What came next was the Holodomor, which means death by hunger. It was a famine engineered with cold, calculating precision. While millions of Ukrainians started to starve, the Soviet state sealed the republic's borders so no one could leave to find food. A new law made stealing even a few stalks of grain from a collective farm an act of sabotage, punishable by death. Watchtowers were built in the fields, and all the while the Soviet Union was exporting millions of tons of grain to the West to pay for its industrialization. The stories from that time are almost too horrible to imagine. Parents killed their own children to spare them a slow death. Cannibalism became a part of daily life. Mass graves were dug all over the once fertile black earth of the Ukrainian countryside. By the time the famine ended in 1933, at least 3.9 million Ukrainians were dead, starved by a regime that prioritized political control over human life. Some estimates put the total deaths across the Soviet Union even higher. The Holodomor wasn't just a policy mistake, it was a weapon of control. It was terror and genocide used to crush Ukrainian nationalism and bend an entire people to the will of the state. This was Stalin's way of ruling. Along with the famine, he perfected the tools of total control. The secret police, now called the NKVD, became an empire. Its spies were in every apartment building, every factory, every corner of society. A careless word to a neighbor could get you a knock on the door in the middle of the night. Then came the Great Purge of the 1930s. Stalin turned his terror machine on the Communist Party itself. Old Bolsheviks, military leaders, intellectuals, artists, anyone who could possibly be an alternative source of power was arrested. They were put on show trials, where they confessed to ridiculous plots of spying and sabotage after being tortured in unimaginable ways. Then they were executed with a bullet to the back of the head. And for those not executed, there was the Gulag. The Gulag was a huge network of forced labor camps that stretched across the Soviet Union, an archipelago of misery and death. Prisoners, both political and criminal, were used as slave labor, cutting down timber in the Arctic cold, mining gold in Kolyma, the coldest inhabited place on Earth, or building massive canals and projects. Conditions were brutal. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion were everywhere. The camps weren't just prisons. They were a key part of the Soviet economy, and a way to get rid of undesirable elements. By the time Stalin died in 1953, the cost of his project to build an equal society was staggering. Historians estimate that his regime killed anywhere from 10 to over 20 million of his own people through executions, deportations, and state-created famines. The promise of bread, peace, and land had been fulfilled with starvation, terror, and a state that owned everything, including the lives of its citizens. The dream of equality had created one of the most monstrous tyrannies the world has ever seen. Half a world away, another revolutionary leader was on his own quest for a perfect equal society. Mao Zedong took power in China in 1949, after decades of civil war and foreign invasion. He promised to end centuries of feudalism and make China great again. His vision was even more extreme than Stalin's. He thought he could use the revolutionary energy of the masses to jump over decades of development and turn China from a poor farming society into a true communist paradise, basically overnight. This ambition led to the Great Leap Forward in 1958. The name alone shows the incredible arrogance of the project. The plan was to mobilize hundreds of millions of people to do two things at once: massively increase farm output and rapidly industrialize. Private farming was completely eliminated. The entire rural population was forced into huge people's communes, giant collective units that controlled every part of life, from work and food to childcare, even burials. Life became completely militarized. Peasants were marched out to work in the fields under the watchful eye of party officials. To industrialize without modern factories, Mao had a bizarre and catastrophic idea: backyard furnaces. He ordered the communes to make steel. Millions of peasants were pulled away from farming to build and run these primitive furnaces in their villages. They melted down everything they could find: pots, pans, farm tools, even doorknobs, to feed the furnaces. The steel they produced was largely unusable. Brittle pig iron that often cracked and contributed nothing to industrial goals. But the human cost was immeasurable. Not only was vital farm labour diverted, but the very tools they needed for farming were destroyed. At the same time, Mao launched the Four Pests campaign, a state-run war on rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. He declared that sparrows ate too much grain and ordered the entire population to kill them. People banged pots and pans for days on end to stop the birds from landing, until they just fell out of the sky, dead from exhaustion. The campaign was a huge success at killing sparrows. It was an ecological disaster of historic proportions. With their main predator gone, the locust population exploded, swarming across the countryside and eating whatever crops were left. The combination of these policies, the communes, the backyard furnaces, the war on sparrows, created a perfect storm. Grain production collapsed. But local party officials, terrified of telling Mao they'd failed, did the opposite. They wildly exaggerated their harvest numbers, reporting phantom bumper crops. Based on this fake data, the central government did the unthinkable. It took even more grain from the countryside to feed the cities, and to export as proof that the Great Leap was a success. The result was the deadliest famine in human history. From 1959 to 1962, a horror fell on the Chinese countryside that made even the Holodomor look small. Food vanished. People were forced to eat tree bark, grass, and leather. In the face of total starvation, all social rules broke down. Reports of cannibalism were common. The state, which had promised abundance, now enforced starvation. Granaries full of grain that was going to be exported were guided by armed militias, while people starved to death right outside the gates. The scale of death is hard to wrap your head around. While we can't get the exact numbers because of the chaos and the official cover-up, scholars estimate that the Great Leap Forward killed somewhere between 15 and 55 million people. Even Liu Shaoqi, who was the president of China at the time, later admitted the disaster was 30% natural disaster and 70% man-made error. You'd think a failure this huge would discredit the leader who caused it, but Mao didn't back down. He doubled down. Afraid his power was slipping, he launched an even more terrifying campaign in 1966, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. If the Great Leap Forward was a war on economics and nature, the Cultural Revolution was a war on the human mind. Mao claimed the revolution was being betrayed from the inside by bourgeois elements and class enemies. To purify China, he called on the nation's youth, organizing them into the fanatical Red Guards. He told them to bombard the headquarters and destroy the four olds. Old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. What came next was a decade of state-sponsored chaos and terror. Students turned on their teachers, beating them, humiliating them in public, sometimes even killing them. Children informed on their own parents. Ancient temples, priceless art, libraries, and historical sites were smashed and burned. Intellectuals, writers, artists, and anyone with a foreign education was targeted as an enemy of the people. They were put through brutal struggle sessions, where they were forced to confess to made-up crimes in front of huge, jeering crowds before being sent to labor camps or just murdered. At the center of it all was the cult of Mao. His face was everywhere. His little red book of quotes became like a holy book. Loyalty to Chairman Mao was more important than any other loyalty. It was a way to get total control, to turn one man into a god whose every word was absolute truth, and whose every whim could mean life or death for millions. By the time the Cultural Revolution finally ended with Mao's death in 1976, it had killed another 1 to 2 million people, and left the nation traumatized and its culture in ruins. In the name of creating a new equal man, Mao's China had waged a war on its own past, its own people, and on human nature itself. Of all the revolutions fought for equality, maybe none took the idea to its most terrifyingly logical conclusion like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, when Pol Pot and his army in black uniforms marched into the capital, Phnom Penh. On April 17th, 1975, they didn't just want to change society, they wanted to erase it and start over from scratch. They called it Year Zero. In their fanatical vision, all of Cambodian history and culture before that day was corrupt and unequal and had to be purged. Their goal was to create a perfectly classless, purely agrarian utopia. There would be no cities, no money, no markets, no schools, no hospitals, no religion, no family. There would only be the new Khmer people, working for the collective, an organisation known only as Angkar, the all-powerful and anonymous organisation. The first act of Year Zero was to empty the cities by force. Within days, the entire population of Phnom Penh, over 2 million people, was driven out at gunpoint and marched into the countryside. The old, the sick, the disabled, pregnant women, no one was spared. If you couldn't keep up, you were just left to die on the side of the road. The cities were to be emptied and left to rot, silent monuments to a dead world. The population was herded into huge rural labour camps, which were really death camps. The new people, the city dwellers, were seen as contaminated by modern, capitalist ideas. They were forced to work in the fields from dusk to dawn on starvation-level rations. The Khmer Rouge ideology said the only pure life was that of a poor, uneducated peasant. So education itself became a crime. The region started a systematic hunt for anyone who represented the old world. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, monks, and artists were targeted for execution. The reasons for being killed became absurdly broad. People were killed for speaking a foreign language. They were killed for having soft hands, because it suggested they didn't do manual labour. They were killed for wearing glasses, because it meant they were an intellectual. Family ties were seen as a threat to total loyalty to Angkar. Children were taken from their parents and taught to spy on them. Any show of love or grief was forbidden. The state controlled everything, from who you could marry to the clothes you had to wear. This wasn't just mass murder, it was auto-genocide, a state turning on its own people to purify them. Country was turned into a vast landscape of killing fields, mass graves where hundreds of thousands were bludgeoned to death to save bullets. In just under 4 years, from April 1975 to January 1979, the Khmer Rouge regime killed about 2 million Cambodians. This was nearly a quarter of the country's entire population. It was the ultimate, most horrific expression of the utopian dream. In the quest to create a perfectly equal society, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge had to destroy everything that makes us human. Our history, our culture, our knowledge, our families, our very individuality. They achieved their Year Zero, but it was the 0 point of civilization itself, a void of unimaginable suffering and death. The stories you've just heard aren't ancient history. The patterns they show aren't stuck in the past. They are stark, brutal warnings about the timeless danger of ideology, the seductive pull of utopia, and what happens when you put absolute power in the hands of people who think they can perfect humanity. These lessons are more important now than ever. If you think understanding this history is key to protecting our future, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. It helps us keep making analyses like this and make sure you won't miss what's coming up next. So, how does this happen? How does the beautiful, inspiring dream of equality lead, with such horrifying consistency, to famine, gulags, and killing fields? It's not enough to just call these leaders monsters. To really get it, we have to dissect the ideological machine that makes these horrors not just possible, but seem necessary to the people doing them. The first fatal flaw is the tyranny of a single big idea. Totalitarian ideologies, whether they're based on class or race, are fundamentally different from normal politics. They don't just offer policies, they offer a total explanation for everything, past, present, and future. They claim to have found an iron law of history, a key that unlocks all its secrets. For Marxists, it was class struggle. For the Nazis, it was racial struggle. Once you buy into that premise, everything else follows with a terrifying, merciless logic. If history is just the story of class struggle, then politics isn't about compromise or debate anymore. It's war. And if a certain class, the bourgeoisie, the kulaks, is defined by this ideology as an obstacle to progress, then getting rid of them isn't a crime. It's a historical necessity. The ideology provides the perfect moral cover for unthinkable acts. It turns political opponents into something less than human. They are parasites, vermin, roadblocks on the path to utopia that have to be cleared away. The second key element is the absolute centralization of power. To re-engineer a whole society based on a single ideological blueprint, you need total control. This is why every one of these revolutions follows the same pattern. The promise of liberation is immediately followed by the grab for power. Independent institutions that could challenge the state, a free press, independent courts, private businesses, churches, are systematically taken apart or taken over. They get absorbed by the party state, which claims to be the one and only representative of the people. This creates a system with zero accountability. As Lord Acton famously warned, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When a single party has a monopoly on all political, economic, and social power, there are no checks, no balances, no limits. The leaders who now represent the will of the people and the truth of the ideology become infallible. To question them is to question the revolution itself. Dissent is no longer a difference of opinion, it's treason. Finally, there's the psychological part, resentment. Totalitarian ideologies are powerful because they give a story and a target to people who feel left behind or humiliated. They don't just promise a better future, they identify a scapegoat for today's problems. The intellectual can resent the capitalist, the peasant can resent the kulak, the worker can resent the factory owner. This resentment is then justified and amplified by the ideology, turning a personal grudge into a righteous crusade. This powerful mix, a single, all-encompassing idea that justifies everything, the total centralization of power that removes all limits, and the weaponization of resentment that gets the masses fired up, is the engine of totalitarianism. It explains how men, who might have started with what they thought were good intentions, became the architects of mass murder. They aren't just seeking power for its own sake, they're trying to force their vision of virtue on the world. And in chasing that forced virtue, they commit the greatest evils. The problem isn't wanting a better world, it's the arrogance of believing that you, and only you, know how to build it, and that any human cost is worth it. It would be nice to think that this pattern is just a relic of the 20th century, but the playbook hasn't been thrown out. We saw a more recent, though less deadly version play out in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez rose to power on a wave of populist anger, promising a Bolivarian revolution that would use the country's oil money to empower the poor and bring social justice. He demonized the elite, nationalized key industries, took control of the media, and systematically dismantled the country's democratic institutions, all in the name of the people. The result wasn't a socialist paradise, but a total economic and social collapse. It led to hyperinflation, chronic shortages of food and medicine, an explosion in violent crime, and millions of people fleeing the country, one of the largest refugee crises in the world. The promise of equality, once again, delivered ruin. Now, it's really important to make a distinction here. The democratic left in Western societies, which pushes for social justice and redistribution through pluralistic competitive systems, is not the same as the authoritarian communism of the 20th century. In fact, many on the left are explicitly anti-totalitarianism. However, the tactics of populist authoritarianism aren't exclusive to one ideology. Leaders on both the left and the right can exploit popular anger to concentrate power, undermine democratic norms, and demonize opponents. The feeling that the people are being betrayed by a corrupt elite is powerful political fuel, no matter who's lighting the match. The debates we're having today about ideas like equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity touch on these historical lessons. Proponents of equality of opportunity say that society should make sure everyone gets a fair start, but that individual differences in talent, effort, and choice will naturally lead to different outcomes. Critics of equality of outcome warn that forcing everyone to end up in the same place requires a dangerous amount of social engineering and state force, because you have to suppress the very thing that makes us human, our diversity. They argue that if you let free people make their own choices, you'll never get equal outcomes, and the only way to force it is through tyranny. On the other hand, critics of our current system, like the philosopher Michael Sandel, argue that even a seemingly fair meritocracy creates its own kind of tyranny. It creates a smug class of winners who think they've earned their success all on their own, and a resentful class of losers who feel looked down on, which eats away at any sense of common good. This division, he argues, fuels the populist anger that can lead to democratic decay. These aren't simple questions, but they force us to face the central tension of this story. How do we pursue justice and fairness without sacrificing the freedom and individuality that are the cornerstones of a humane society? Now, before we wrap up, it is important to say this. Everything you've just heard is based on extensive historical research and facts that are freely available to anyone willing to look. We are not here to push one ideology over another. We are simply here to scrutinize power wherever it lives. No political system, no matter how well-intentioned, should be immune to criticism. Yes, this video is focused on what went catastrophically wrong under regimes that promised equality, but in our next video, we're turning the lens on capitalism, because it too has failed millions in different but equally destructive ways. Corruption, exploitation, inequality, and greed aren't exclusive to any one system. And if we're serious about understanding how power shapes the world, we have to be willing to question everything. So subscribe so you can see that video when it appears. The 20th century stands as a giant monument to a failed idea. The idea that humanity can be perfected. The idea that a single group, armed with a social truth, can engineer a utopia. The revolutions that promised a world of equals delivered a world of masters and slaves, of party officials and camp prisoners, of interrogators and the interrogated. They showed us that the road to hell is paved not with just good intentions, but with the ruthless, arrogant certainty that you know the way to heaven. The greatest lesson from these tragedies is humility. It's recognizing that society is infinitely complex, and that people are not just cogs in a machine to be moved around. True equality isn't found in forcing everyone into the same box, but in upholding the equal and sacred dignity of every individual, their rights to think for themselves, to chase their own goals, to live their own lives free from the orders of an all-powerful state. The desire for justice, for a fairer world, is one of our noblest instincts, but history screams a warning. Beware of those who offer simple fixes for complex problems. Beware of those who divide the world into the pure and the impure, the saved and the damned. And most of all, beware of those who promise to build a paradise on earth, because they will always end up creating a hell. The problem isn't wanting equality. It's what happens when one group gets the power to force their definition of it on everyone else. I'm Josh, and this is The Villainous Vault. Thanks for watching.